Well, kia ora koutou, ngami nui kia ora koutou. Greetings everybody, it's really nice to be here. And I guess perhaps I'll start off by making just a few sort of general comments, and then the most important thing is for you to ask questions and sort of engage with it, I guess. Is that sort of everything? Yeah.
Sounds good, yeah.
Yeah, so I was, I grew up in Dunedin, and then we moved to Napier, and then eventually to Auckland. In 1977 I moved to Auckland, and I was teaching there. I got involved in the anti-apartheid movement when I was in Napier, and so I was running a little anti-apartheid group there with a few other people. And when I moved to Auckland, I got involved in HEART, and gradually sort of got more and more involved. I was teaching at the time, and got involved, and then in 1980 I worked, we had the 1981 tour coming up, so on Labour Weekend 1979 we had stopped the 81 tour conference in Orurua and Wellington. So this was almost 2 years before the Springboks came. We knew they were coming, they were on the schedule, and we were planning to stop the tour. And our strategy was simply to get education out there, leaflets, pamphlets, films, and get the New Zealand public to understand what was happening in South Africa. Because the key thing was that what was happening in South Africa was brutal oppression of 80% of the population by, in fact, about 17% of the population that were white, and the apartheid system. And black South Africans had really worked hard to protest, to gain their freedom, and they were met with brutal repression from the police and the army, again and again and again, until they finally took up arms in 1960. They formed Umkhonto we Sizwe, which means the spear of the nation, and Mandela was leading that. And then, so they were leading a big struggle, but they were met with brutal repression. In fact, in the late 1950s, they then called on the world to help. They said, look, we're facing brutality here, and we need the world's help. And what they asked for, they didn't say, send us guns, send us arms. They said, boycott South Africa. Don't have anything to do with white South Africa. And that way, that'll be solidarity with our struggle. And very quickly, a lot of countries took it up really quickly through Africa, and India was very quick to pick it up because there was a big Indian population in South Africa around Durban. They were brutally oppressed, so India was the first Commonwealth country to pick it up, but then the whole world gradually began to pick it up. There were three countries that were real outliers who were not picking up the boycott, and that was the US, the UK, and New Zealand. And we were often singled out as one of the worst, because we had what white South Africa wanted the most, which was rugby contact between the Springboks and the All Blacks. It was the biggest event in South Africa, the biggest event in rugby in New Zealand, and that's what they prized. And therefore we had the opportunity to put real pressure on one of the key links South Africa had with the outside world. So we thought, New Zealand, we can punch above our weight on this one. If we can pressure the rugby link, then we're only a tiny little country of 2.5 million back then. We could have a really much bigger impact on the world stage, and that's why we picked on. So that's how HEART began, and why we organised this big protest in '81. So we started off by education, and when we started off, about 1979, the public opinion polls, I can't remember exactly, they were around about 15% were opposed to the tour. Probably about half the people thought it was good, and then there was a group in the middle that weren't really sure. And by the time the Springboks arrived, so 2 years later after this big campaign of ours, big education campaign, we shifted public opinion to about 45% were opposed to the tour. And 45% were very strongly in favour of the tour. Very small number in the middle who either didn't have an opinion or refused to give an opinion when people rang them up. And we thought this is really good. Half the country quite strong supporting the boycott. And the problem was the demographics in those days was, we had first past the post, the electoral system on first past the post, which is prior to MMP, right? First past the post said there were no party lists, no list MPs. The only MPs in Parliament were from electorates. And the way it worked out that Labour would win the big city seats, National would win the country areas, and the battlefield was in provincial New Zealand, so the medium-sized towns. So New Plymouth, Gisborne, Invercargill, Taupo, those were the 4 key seats. And in all those provincial seats, there was strong support for the tour. So Muldoon was the National Party Prime Minister in 1981. There was an election coming up at the end of the year, and he knew if he could win those 4 seats, that he would retain the government. And he said, if I give the people, this is, cynical political manipulation, if you like. He let the tour go ahead because he was looking at the election at the end of the year. And he was right, he won. They won the election at the end of the year because those 4 seats went to National. And Muldoon scraped through with a win in the election. But in the meantime, the whole country had been sort of ripped apart by that. The only other thing I'll say as introduction is there's a really, really important history going back to 1920s of Māori involvement with South Africa, because you would have done this. In 1960, a huge movement, no Māoris, no tour. The All Blacks were due to go to South Africa, and South Africa said, we're not going to take any Māori players. And that went right back to 1928. George Napier, the best All Black that the All Blacks had ever, the best fullback the All Blacks had ever had, was due to play 1928, and he was denied entry to the All Blacks because of that. And then in 1960, he was one of the speakers at a big public meeting in the Auckland Town Hall saying, no Māoris, no tour. He said, I didn't get the chance to go because I was Māori. Why are we letting South Africa choose our rugby teams for us? New Zealand should choose its team. And the rugby union, to its shame really, and it has apologised to the players. About 5 years ago they issued a formal apology to the people who've been left out of the All Blacks when they went to South Africa. So there's a whole history there going back. And I'll just mention one little thing because it sticks in my mind when I was saying that. 1921 was the first time the Springboks came on a full tour to New Zealand, and they were scheduled to play the Māoris in Napier. Okay? The Māoris, they're playing the Māoris in Napier. And it was a ferocious game, and I can't even remember the result. But one of the South African journalists with the team, no such thing as the internet then, but they would send their messages by telegraph. So he was writing a report of the game to send it back to South Africa. So he wrote this report of the game, and in it he said the worst thing wasn't the fact that we had to play these Māoris, these non-whites. He said the worst thing was there were Europeans in the stands cheering for the Māori team. This was appalling, he said. They were undermining their own race. And of course, so when he took it into the post office to send this off, one of the women who was, they had to type it into this thing, she leaked it to the Daily Telegraph, which was the local newspaper, and it was all over the local newspaper, and caused a huge furore because these, South Africans didn't have, they couldn't understand why Europeans were cheering for the Māori All Blacks, because they had such a segregated society, and they had such ideas of racial superiority and all the rest of it that went along. Yeah. So anyway, that was the lead up to it, and so that's, So we had the big protests, and I guess the rest will come out in questions.
We got some inspirations here. I guess the chants were a big thing, showing how these people influenced the protest movement.
Yeah, very much so. This is, Steve Biko, you all recognise Steve Biko, and the anniversary of his death was the 12th of September 1981, I think the 5th anniversary. So on the day of the last game being played, it was the anniversary of his death, and so there was a special Steve Biko memorial march that went right around Eden Park on that day. This is probably 1960 in Sharpeville, where people burned their passes. You know the picture? Yeah. Blacks had to carry their passes. Burning their passes, and that was it was the reaction of the South African police and the army to that demonstration that caused the ANC to say, you know, there's 69 people shot. Most of them were shot in the back as they were running away from the police and the army. And at that point, the ANC said, no, we've got to take up armed struggle. We can't be facing bullets when we don't have any way of fighting back. So they formed that group, Contra West Way. And they tried to, they used to, they attacked infrastructure. They would go out at night and they would blow up the railway lines. They would blow up the power pylons so that, you know, a European city would go, you know, white city would go into the, you know, would lose their power and stuff like that. They tried to do that, and that they had some successes and some profile, but 1963 they were, you know, Mandela he'd been in and out of the country. He was arrested at a farm called Rivonia, and they had a Rivonia trial, and he was given sort of life in prison. He spent 26 years in prison. Yeah, just while I'm on that, he 26 years in prison, and you know, he said when they heard that we had stopped the game in Hamilton, I can't blame anyone but myself. I'll just turn that off. Sorry. He said that he was in his cell, and he said the prisoners in the prisoners on Robben Island, in their cells, he said when they heard that the game had been called off, this was the very first game that was ever broadcast live to South Africa. You know, we take broadcasts for granted now. They never had live broadcasts. You could listen to a radio broadcast. This was television, live television. So South Africa, white South Africans got up in the middle of the night to watch the All Blacks play, to watch the Springboks play in Waikato. And all they saw was this big protest on the field and a game that was cancelled. Mandela was in his cell on Robben Island. He said when the prisoners heard that, because some of the guards had been up watching the thing, he said they grabbed the doors of their cells and they rattled them right round the prison. He said it was like the sun came out. So, you know, little old New Zealand having a really big impact on, certainly on the psychology of white and black South Africans. That's Hector Peterson there, you know, the first 11-year-old shot in the big Soweto uprising. You know, they organised four protest marches to come to Orlando Stadium, and the police turned up, and yeah, and in the next 6 months, 600 children, your age and younger, 600 school children were murdered by the South African police and the army, just shot dead on the streets. 600 in the second half of 1976, and after that, the world was furious at New Zealand. This happened. And a few months later, the All Blacks went to South Africa to play the Springboks. And the world was furious. And the whole world was furious with New Zealand. We were absolute pariahs. They tried to get us thrown out of the Olympic Games, 1976. And African countries brought a resolution for New Zealand to be thrown out. And the resolution was lost. This is in Montreal. The resolution was lost. And then 29 countries just said, well, if New Zealand's in, we're out. So they walked out. So African countries, Caribbean countries, and that's why Philbert Bayi from Tanzania and John Walker from New Zealand were due to clash in 1,500 metres. It was the big event of the 1976 Games, and Philbert Bayi left as part of the boycott, and John Walker won. And there's the cell. I was in that cell on Robben Island in 2009. I went over to South Africa.
You mentioned the education campaign.
Yep.
So we've been watching little bits of this documentary here and there, and at the start of it is you guys doing your education leaflet drops and things.
Yeah.
And there's a bit of the response, a bit of the hate mail which you got sent back to you.
Yeah.
And there was yesterday we watched a really interesting start of it where there's just having a debate on the street with average Kiwis.
Yeah.
I guess it must have been in Auckland.
In Auckland, yeah, that's all Auckland. Yeah, that was one of the more polite ones. We did this leaflet drop in Auckland. We did the leaflet drop in Auckland, and there was 100,000 leaflets. 100,000 leaflets on one day. So we had the whole city divided up into these grids. This was Dick Cuthbert, who was in charge of doing that, and it was anyway divided into grids. And so on 100,000 would go out, and then the next week there would be a pile of this would come back in through our mailbox. Some people would wipe their backside in the leaflet, put it in an envelope and send it to us. It was that kind of thing. It was pretty full on. And this is a Gestepner machine, which was like a printing machine. I mean, it replaced by photocopiers and printers these days, but this is a cheap way of printing a lot of things quite quickly. Gestepner.
What's MOST? Is that
It stood for Mobilisation to Stop the Tour. That was the coalition in Auckland. So there were coalitions all around the country. In Wellington, Christchurch, there was a CAT. It was called CAT, Coalition Against the Tour. So that's a lot of different groups come together to join forces. So this was trade unions and church groups and student groups from the universities, school students your age. School students here in Christchurch used to turn up with their banners to the protests. Linwood College against the tour. I don't know if there was a Christchurch Boys High one, but there were a lot of schools had their own banners there, and students from all across the country got involved. And some schools, their first 15s, pulled out of the rugby competition altogether in protest. Said they would not play rugby that season because they because of this event. Yep.
Second game.
Yep.
The one that got stopped.
Yep. We knew we could get a lot of people down to Hamilton, and so the second game we went down a few days before. About 6 of us in a van. And we went down and we cased the place, right? And we worked out where the best place to break in was. And as it turned out, we were able to get a big crowd up close, and we had all these things. We had big bolt cutters, we had those carabiners, we had ropes, clip a carabiner on the fence and pull it down. People were just really, the passion, the feeling was very, very intense. People were so angry with the rugby union, so angry with the government. They were ready to break the law, like in that way. And in the end, all those things weren't needed because people just grabbed the fence and it just peeled like a banana, with those mesh fences. And we got on the field. And that's a pretty mixed bag of people there. Yeah.
Who's the priest? There was a big crucifix in there as well.
Yeah.
Being carried around.
Yeah, the crucifix came from St John's Theological College, so they were theology students from Auckland. There was a whole lot of young theology students who were activists, right? There was a group of 3 Baptists studying to be Baptist ministers. They were absolutely fantastic. They'll all be in there somewhere. This is George Armstrong. He was with the St John's College as well. He's a better peace activist all his life, and he's a great guy. Somewhere buried in there is me.
The people who got arrested that day,
Yep.
Were they released pretty much straight away? Charged and then let go? Or?
They were, let go that night, yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah. And yourself, I guess one of the questions out here which I read was, how come they didn't just say, we'll take out the leadership, we'll grab them at a game and we'll just, tie them up in the court system?
Yep, well, they tried that. We had a policy of not having, we had about 5 spokespeople, and we always kept the spokespeople never in the one place at the one, all together, so we were always spread around the country. And so I went to probably 2/3 of the matches, and other people went to other ones. No, they after this game, they tried to get a binding over order to keep the peace. So this is where the police go to the court and they say, we want, it was myself and another woman, young Māori activist, Rebecca Evans, and they wanted us to be bound over to keep the peace, which means that you have to sign a binding over order, which means you sign to say that as soon as you do anything wrong at all, if you drop a piece of litter on the ground, you can be arrested. So, and we said no, that's complete. That would be a complete against the rights of people to protest. And the court, when they first tried it, the court just said, no way, there's no way we're going to do this. But, I mean, the courts were divided as well. And they could see that it was that there was lots of passion, there was a lot of public support, and that it would be very unpopular if they'd given that to the police and tried to pick people off, but it wouldn't have worked. And then Muldoon, halfway through the tour, Muldoon put out this list from the SIS. He said, these are, what do you call it? a list of radicals and subversives, and they called me a radical, and there were 5 radicals and 5 subversives or something, I can't remember what it was. They were trying to move public opinion against us, against the leadership of the anti-tour movement, but it completely failed, completely failed. People wouldn't buy it, people could understand this was a really important issue.
First battening.
Yes, first battening. Yeah, Molesworth Street in Wellington. And if you look at the people here, there's not many helmets on here, amongst our lot anyway. But if you look at the protests afterwards, everybody was wearing helmets, or not everybody, but lots of people wearing helmets. And chest protectors, you know. Those cardboard rolls, about 10 of them, and then wrapped around with corrugated cardboard and held up around your neck to protect your chest, and then you had newspapers rolled up around your arms here to protect your body, helmet on. That was necessary. And wearing a cricket box too was necessary. Yeah, so that's Molesworth Street. Yep, that's Mark Jones. He's a great guy, Mark. He lives in Auckland, and very courageous thing to do. He ended up with 6 months in jail for that. But he was, and his partner Grant Cole was in there. He was dropping flower bombs out. They hit an All Black. A guy called Knight, I can't remember his first name, got hit with one of these flower bombs and briefly a bit groggy on the field. And they got charged with assaulting various people because the bombs hit some of the flower bombs. Before they got it lined up properly, some of these were hitting the stands instead of hitting on the field.
Did you know he was going to do this? Or was this part of the campaign?
Yeah, well, I did. Marx came to me. He used to drive these big petrol, the big petrol tankers around the city, filling up things, so big shell tankers. And he arrived one day, and he said, "Oh, come out and talk to me." So we went out and we sat in the cab of his truck with the engine going. It was really noisy. They didn't want anyone overhearing what he was going to say, because we were being spied on all the time. And he said, "Look, I'm planning to do this. What do you think? Will it be seen as just an individual action, or will it be seen as part of the overall thing?" And I said, "It's part of the overall thing, Lots of people were doing that individual things." I said, "If you can, I totally support. The movement will back you up and support you," which we did. I mean, we always arranged lawyers, and we arranged help and what have you. Yeah, so they hired a plane, and he got on his plane, and he drove it out. And he taxied it out to the end of the runway, and his friend Grant Cole was in the bushes with a big suitcase full of these flower bombs. Rushed out onto the field, got into the plane before anyone had realised, and they'd taken off. They had every time the plane went over, there was huge cheers. There were huge protests around the park. Tens of thousands of people giving them, cheering them on. It was an uplifting moment. Yeah.
Then you got these guys.
Yeah.
What I find interesting with this is the protest, the change in almost tactics. Would you say you were always non-violent?
Yeah, we did. We stuck to it. We very much we had a policy of non-violent direct action, and that meant being, you prepared to break the law, but you wouldn't. We avoided damage to people. We said we don't condone anyone hitting anyone, or that sort of thing. That kind of broke down in the last game, right? It did. And there was there'd been such a build-up of tension during the tour. It all kind of spilled out in these scenes around the park on the final day. So our people got bashed up, and the cops did all the bashing of people as well. So the clowns, I don't know if you know about the clowns, 3 clowns that got bashed, really badly hurt. That was just gratuitous. And the police covered it up, the police in charge. This is Muapua. He's a lovely guy. He lives on Waiheke Island now. He asked me to come and speak to the KCs, the King Cobras, because he was a youth worker in